monstrous. The basic thrust behind my work has been to try to put a face on the numbers, and the best estimates that we have for slaves in the world today are there are between 12.3 and 27 million slaves. These are people that are forced to work, held through fraud, under threat of violence for no pay beyond subsistence. And they're held in all different industries, in all different parts of the world, in urban and rural areas, and they are really held everywhere and nowhere. And so part of my role as a journalist, and part of all of your role as a journalist, is to find stories of people that ordinarily don't have a voice and allow them to speak through you. That is very much what I feel is my calling as a journalist, and one of the advantages that I have, and one of the gifts that all of us have in this profession. Now, are all of you journalism majors? Is that right? No, but gotcha. But sort of communications. Okay, sort of the general undercurrent of journalism-ish stuff. This is, I think, a profession that's come in for a lot of criticism over the last few years. I remember seeing a survey that journalists are less trusted than politicians now, which is not a good sign. But it's also, I think, while there can be some skullduggery in it, it's also a field that has the potential to greatly uplift humanity, and it's an extremely rewarding job, I've found. So I'm happy to talk about slavery. I'm happy to talk about journalism, and the floor is now open for your questions. Yeah, in the first chapter of the book, I go into some detail on my thought process. To be clear, over the course of the research, I've been in several situations where I've been offered individuals for sale, or I've witnessed the sale of human beings. I have never given money to a trafficker, and I will not buy a human being. The reason for that is not some abstract principle, but actually something that I developed over a series of conversations, over a great deal of research, looking at what happens when well-meaning people go in and actually buy slaves in order to free them. And invariably what happens is, well, one of two things happen. One, you're giving rise to a trade in human misery. You're monetizing what might, or what oftentimes would be some sort of a barter arrangement, or some sort of anyway, a negotiated arrangement that didn't involve hard currency. And by injecting hard currency, you're giving a lot of encouragement, and you're giving rise to a trade in human misery. The other thing that may happen is fraud, and the person that you may be given might be somebody who's born in an unfortunate situation, but not necessarily a slave. I, for example, early on in this process, I was on assignment for Newsweek in Sudan at the end of the war, and was traveling with a group that called itself Christian Solidarity International, and this group, in theory, was going in and giving over literally duffel bags full of hard currency of dollars in exchange for Sudanese pounds, which is an unbacked, untraded currency. Essentially, it's paper. and with those Sudanese pounds, they would then be giving those Sudanese pounds, in theory, to traders, to intermediaries, who would then go and somehow wave a magic wand and bring these slaves out of the north that had been taken as part of the process of depopulating the southern areas with the North-South genocide. It's a very complicated war. A very simple and elegant solution in theory: pay $50 and free a slave. And they went across. This group went across the United States, particularly going into Sunday schools and encouraging people of all ages, but particularly children. If you can just come up with $50 for this, you'll be freeing this slave. What I found was that there was no verification of who these people were. The intermediaries were all aligned with the cash-starved rebels. And what I did, and again, part of our role as journalists is to not accept the official line on anything. And when I went in 2003, every other journalist that had traveled with this group had been sort of led on this hermetically sealed tour, and never allowed to ask any questions that weren't passed first through Sudan People's Liberation Army translators, rebel translators. In other words, they were controlling the flow of information. So what I did is I went back. I caught a ride in a UN Cessna and went back to the exact same place after this Christian Solidarity International group had left. And what I found was a very, very different story. What I found was that people acknowledged openly that this was their only way of getting hard currency at a time when the international community had largely abandoned the Southern rebel movement, and that this was a way for them of shoring up their actions, their military actions, and their tactical actions. The CSI was also at the time bringing in mercenaries. They were bringing in former special forces, American special forces, former Spetsnaz, Russian special forces, former SAS, British special forces, to train the Southern commanders, the rebel commanders, how to mount heavy machine guns on the back of Hondas, et cetera, et cetera. Map out routes, scale out routes to Khartoum, train them in logistical coordination for battlefield operations, all of which kind of you question, well, what does that have to do with slavery? And if you buy the argument that that the only thing to stop slavery in Sudan is to topple the government in Khartoum, then that has everything to do with slavery. But if you recognize, as most people do, that that was a fantasy, then all that you're doing is serving as an angel of destruction in a situation like that. The bottom line for all of this is that simple fixes to complex humanitarian problems oftentimes make us feel very good, because it gives us the sense of, oh, I'm doing something, done, this problem's taken care of, and I've done my good deed for the day. Just as often, they do nothing more than that for us, and they don't actually solve the problem, and in many cases, they make the problems much, much worse. And in that particular instance, when the peace negotiations to end that god-awful war were going on across the border in Kenya and Machakos, and you have this group of very zealous, quote-unquote, abolitionists funding a war to keep that war going, and funding a particular faction within the rebel movement that was at odds with the leadership in Machakos, you're causing more devastation, more destruction. We have to be very careful about how we act, and I would go a step further and bring in that Idaho church group that was down in Haiti immediately after the earthquake. Again, I have no reason to believe they had anything other than pure intentions, but when you're pulling children away who you subsequently say are orphans, who in fact weren't orphans, um, you're breaking families apart, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. Um, Media outlets, that's tough. Um, I mean, I generally, there's really very little that I read that I don't question. I question everything. And I think, um, the only thing that I don't question is when I go out and see something with my own eyes, or take the story myself when I'm out in the field. And that's why, if you read the stuff that I write, that is 90% of the information that I'm relying on and putting forward as fact, is things that I've seen, or things that I've heard first person. But even then, I'm saying, this person says, or this is what I'm seeing here. That's what I can describe. I think, in terms of the issue of modern day slavery, there are certain sources that are pretty reliable, and one of them is there's an office within the State Department, which is grossly underfunded, but staffed by some really impressive people. One of whom is actually going to be here at the conference on human trafficking starting tomorrow. This is the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and they put out a report on an annual basis that attempts to quantify and qualify how every nation on earth is doing to monitor and combat slavery. At the same time, they're very blunt about the fact that, particularly on this issue, there are no good numbers out there. Slaves are not people that stand in line, raise their hands, and wait for the census to be taken. And so, when we're talking about this population, we're talking about a hidden population. We're talking about best estimates for numbers, and so I come back to this idea that we really have to do our work as journalists, to get out there, to find individual stories, and then to verify. And the stories that I was taking from survivors, I would always go and try to find others that had been connected to their lives that could help me verify the details. I mean, just by virtue of somebody saying that they're a victim doesn't give them carte blanche in my mind. I have to be able to verify what it is that they're saying. I'll report what they're saying, but to report it as fact and to a great degree of certainty in my own mind means a lot of due diligence.